fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery.
Well, welcome back into the House of Mystery. I'm Al Warren. Mr. Joe Goldberg is sitting quietly, demure.
Yes. We're all exhausted, right?
Yeah.
And prepping for the Thanksgiving season. Here, do you guys have Thanksgiving up there? Do you do?
No, we don't.
No?
We don't thank anything for giving.
No, that's right.
No, our Thanksgiving is run around harvest, so it's the end of it. So it's in October always.
It's kind of the same principle in some ways, except for
it's just not set.
That's why I'm making up recipes right now because everybody comes here and I'm the cooker. So it's
yeah,
kind of like Robert. Robert's.
I was going to say you're going to cook the raven.
I'm a cooker raven. And there's nothing else, but you got to marinate them though, so they can be really chewy.
Oh yeah,
those ravens, especially Robert's raven.
Yeah, which raven? Well, I wonder which raven it is. The one from the Monsters, or is it the one from Vincent Price?
No, it's a hacker.
It's
Raven the hacker, right, Robert?
Right. Absolutely.
Oh, there we go. We're going to find out. Today we're going to talk about a recently released book called Raven. It's a novel, and the author is here to talk about it. That's Robert T. Kelley. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Robert, the Raven. Let's talk about the premise of this book so people get what the story is all about.
Raven's set at a very particular moment, what I describe as the end of the Cold War and the beginning of the Internet. It's set at the beginning of 1990 at MIT. And this was a really interesting moment in technology history and in kind of the history of the world. The Cold War really was ending, and kind of, I think to the shock of many folks, what we thought was sort of this permanent, duality of the Soviet Union and the United States was beginning to fall apart. And so there was this moment of potential hope and kind of, the possibility of, a whole new world. It was the same for technology. This was early days. This is pre-World Wide Web. This is mostly pre-cell phones. And this technology was beginning to leak into world culture, particularly American culture. And it just strikes me as such an interesting moment because there was this great possibility, but also still the sort of looming threat of, what the superpowers might end up doing to each other. And that's part of the reason that I set it at this moment, because it was also a moment of great innocence about the impact technology would have on us. I've joked with friends that Google in 1999 could say, "Don't be evil," and it wasn't a punchline. You really had people who believed that technology could help us be better, can help us collaborate, could help us be closer to one another. And, it didn't quite work out that way. But this was a particularly fun time to set it also because you still have Cold War intrigue happening. All of the technology is brand new. And, I dropped my character, Mev Hayes, in the middle of a lot of intrigue and make her work her way out.
Hey, Robert, I was at the agency during this whole time frame you wrote about, the late 80s and the 90s.
Yeah.
I was interviewing someone at the Berlin Wall fell, and I was in technology, the analog to digital transition. So your book really hit some chords for me. And I'm kind of wondering, how did you get inside the mindset of sort of the Cold War spirit and hacking world? I know you come from the IT sort of technology background, but how did you get inside sort of the spy thing? Why don't you maybe tell how you merged your interest in that IT with this Cold War espionage world?
Yeah, I think, I'm not sure that I can resurrect exactly when it occurred to me that there needed to be sort of an espionage element to it. I think it felt natural that if I thought about what are the existential threats in that moment that would balance kind of the hopefulness of what technology might bring us. It strikes me that, the Cold War, as, we saw it portrayed, that, so many great writers, but I'm thinking particularly John le Carré, the way he portrayed, for example, Smiley, a very imperfect person, but also incredibly dedicated to, his role in, supporting his country. It really hit me that there was a degree of, and again, I think of it in terms of innocence, that, there were real people doing really bad things, and the Cold War was a serious conflict. I'm of the generation who was told to duck and cover under my desk in nuclear air raid drills. And so that existential threat was not yet gone. We as modern readers know what happened after, but in that moment, it was still a real worldwide global threat. And I think what was really interesting was to drop someone who has a degree of innocence into the middle of, into the spy world, and to not give her skills that are a spy's skills, but give her skills that are a hacker's skills that, would not in that moment have necessarily been that common. Not that technology wasn't being used in the spy world, it definitely was. And that was another fun thing to play with is, this is still the moment when the internet is not a public domain quite yet. It's universities and the Department of Defense. The internet comes from an ARPA project, Advanced Research Project Administration, which was essentially to create a distributed network that could survive a nuclear attack. So it was very much still this specialist knowledge, the same way espionage is. And so it was fun to put the two together. And because this was such a pivotal moment in history, and because, especially in retrospect, we see the dawn of technology and know what happened with it. We see the end of the Cold War and know what happened with that, and yet similar threats still remain, and technology has not turned out to be quite the unmitigated good that I think a lot of the early technologists thought it would be.
Well, that's my next question, because I also teach this stuff. And I always bring to my class about how when the internet came along, everybody thought it was going to merge the world. Everybody's going to be happy. Everybody's got access, and undervoiced have voices. But that's not the way it turned out in the end. So how did you grasp that inside your book? Did you use the hacker, the Mitnick kind of world, or how did you ruin the innocence?
That's a great, and Kevin Mitnick, of course, his name is in the book, because he would be a logical person who people would have been aware of as a hacker in the news. But also, what I really leaned hard into was the fact that at this moment, there were still a lot of, and the word hacker has kind of evolved. In this moment, it was still mostly not pejorative. The word actually comes from the MIT Model Railroad Club. They referred to themselves as hackers. So in this moment, a lot of the hackers, a lot of people playing around in computer networks, some were malicious, like Kevin Mitnick, but a lot of them were just exploring a new world. They just suddenly found this, this walled garden that they could go play in. It was specialized knowledge. It was accessible if you knew how to get to it, but even knowing how to get to it was something you had to learn. But you'd be, in this moment in the internet, things like, for example, the rules of how the internet worked, naming conventions, protocols, were all essentially done in a public forum. There were things called requests for comments. And you, as just, John Doe, could comment on an internet protocol. So it's this moment of real egalitarianism. And that just strikes me as kind of fun because, our world now is dominated by big tech, and we are completely distanced from how that tech is used. Oftentimes, you think about Shoshana Zuboff's work, Surveillance Capitalism, and the fact that our data is exploited whether we want it to be or not. We're very far away from the innocence of this moment when the technology was still widely accessible and relatively democratic.
I feel like we should have the Coca-Cola commercial from the 60s. Everyone's, I like to teach the world to sing.
Yeah, teach the world to sing, yeah.
That was written by Don Draper.
Right, exactly right. Yeah, the wrap-up for Mad Men. I mean, and that's, I guess that's part of why it was really interesting to me because, there is real good and bad in the world. There are bad actors who want to do you harm. But in this moment, the hackers were often the good guys. But, the Soviet Union was our adversary, and there were bad people spying against the interests of the United States. There were people who, would do things solely for money. One of the other antagonists in the book is the Irish mob in Boston. And this was the moment when the Irish mob was still ascendant. And, This was the very moment, in fact, and I actually speak about this in the book, where Whitey Bulger, Irish mobster in Southie, has a brother, Billy Bulger, who is the president of the Massachusetts State Senate. That's one family.
Of course.
That kind of dichotomy was just so much fun to engage with as a writer.
Yeah, and it was different because now I think in today's times you can do things in the open and tell people you're not, or tell people it's okay, and they believe it. Whereas in the old days you had to be very careful on how you appeared to others.
And yeah, that's an interesting point, because I think that, one of the things that I engage with the primary antagonist, who is a professor at MIT, who's a bad guy, and pretty toxic, but he still cares about his reputation, even though he's an incredibly bad guy. And, now today we would look at him and completely, ostracize him. But in that moment, he could work somewhat with impunity because no one knew. And that is another interesting thing about this moment, is that although, my characters are engaging with that early internet, and have all this specialized knowledge, how we think about getting access to information has changed so radically in the last 35 years. Everything from, there's a scene where she has to go find a payphone in order to basically report a crime. And, there are missed calls, to the fact that, to get access to information did require these specialized skills. You couldn't just, pick up your cell phone and Google it.
So your main character, what do you do to get into that character to make her sound real?
Great question. So I was an early user of the internet. So I was on what was then called Usenet, which were essentially electronic bulletin boards. I had access because I have an engineering degree, so I went to the University of Missouri at Rolla. I was then at Indiana University to get my PhD in English, and was on the early internet because I was on a university campus. So part of it for me is going back to what I know now, and essentially, dialing back to the moment when this was all just cool and I was innocent about all of it. So did I believe that technology was going to make the world a better place? Absolutely. And then to just take that and kind of turn it up to 11. Take somebody who is a little more naive, but also not disempowered. What she comes to find is that the thing that she has embraced just because it was a way to keep from being bullied in high school, which was learning how to program, is a superpower in the right moment. And so for me, it was always about thinking about really the levers of power in a relationship. She enters the relationship with her mentor with almost no power, but must come by the end of the novel to embrace her power. And so the way I got into that was really thinking about what's the path of a character to say, I have no choice but to claim my power because no one else will do it for me. And that journey was part of the journey of writing the novel. So interestingly, this novel has been brewing for years and years and years. When I thought it was ready to be published in 2019, I sent it out to agents, and I sent it to more than 50 agents, no takers, which tells me it wasn't ready. But gloriously, one agent wrote me 6 bullet points. And one of the things they said was, this character is not empowered enough. That was a fundamental change for me, to realize that I had put a character in a position where she was a victim of the events around her and was just carried by the plot. And I needed to flip that. I needed to turn her into the hero. So that was a very conscious choice for me, is to create a journey in which she finds her power and is required to claim it in order to get to her successful conclusion. So that was a very conscious set of edits over the last several years.
So you didn't know your character. Well, you had a different set of characteristics for your character in your mind. The agent gave you a sort of a different direction. What were the kind of things that you pulled out of people you knew, people you related to, that said, okay, these are the empowerment characteristics required for my character to grow throughout this time?
That's a great question. I had a specific person in mind for this character who I'd had in mind when I started, and then I'd kind of gotten off track, and then I rethought it. This is also a moment when women are really starting to gain power in the engineering field. They were still discriminated against. They still had to fight like hell to get any attention, but they were beginning to make progress. And so what I needed to do was get my mindset in the place where this is someone who must be strong just in order to compete, not to necessarily win, though she does, but even to be at the table. And the journey then was for me to write the character who comes to realize I actually can shine in this moment against ridiculous odds, in a situation where, she has been tricked into breaking the law, a law which, by the way, has as one of its potential, penalties for breaking it, the death penalty, because she has helped, she has been complicit in committing espionage, and to credibly find her way out of that. For me, it was really about channeling how much strength it would take for someone to say, against these odds, I can prevail.
Well, then who's the Raven? Is that the bad person, or
the Raven? There's some fun attributes to the word. The reason the novel is actually called Raven, and it was a fairly late change for me. It had other titles prior. I was thinking about how hackers work, and early hackers, if you wanted to show off to your buddies, what you'd do is you'd come back with something. So you'd go into AT&T, and you'd come back with the 911 procedures manual, which actually happened and was a huge scandal in the moment. It was actually part of a number of cases that the Secret Service and FBI brought against innocent victims. There was a question of how much that was actually worth. There was a question of if it was publicly available, why was this a crime? So, ravens collect shiny objects. So that just struck me as kind of apropos. A raven is, you probably know, Joe, raven is the male counterpart to a sparrow. It's a male spy who creates a honey trap in order to attract a woman. And then also just the name itself is a handle used by a hacker who is an important part of the story. And you learn very quickly, what happens to that individual. You don't understand the relationship to that name until much later. But it's important because that's a red herring that the FBI can't quite figure out. So the name ends up mattering in the plot because, there's a question of who is this person. So it was a fun coincidence that this all kind of, conspired, to coin a phrase, conspired together to make a good title for the book.
So from before you got the book published to now that it's published and done, how do you think it's changed your writing process or the way you do a book? So for your next book, how will it be different? Do you kind of know what that is?
I do. In fact, I owe my book to my publisher in January. So this morning I was actually doing some final draft work. Yeah, a number of things. I think you learn a lot on the ground. It's both ridiculous to say this, but also I'm kind of proud of it. This book went through over 50 drafts because it wasn't ready, and I knew it wasn't ready, but that didn't mean I knew how to make it ready. Huge shout out to my publisher here, High Frequency Press. They also run a conference called the Writers Hotel, and I had attended that in 2023. And as part of attending that conference, it's a by acceptance only conference. They were looking at writers who are either close to the beginning of their career or early career, and really helping them refine their work. And as part of admittance to the conference, they read a full manuscript. And I was 60% through a revision of Raven, and they read it and gave me spectacular feedback, which, was huge. The conference was in May. I was rewriting it all summer. I started pitching agents again in the fall. And then the editor, Shannon McNair, reached out to me and said, we've started press and we'd like you to be part of our inaugural group of authors. Huge impact on my writing and my writing career, but also working so closely with Shanna and her husband Scott, and they were the co-editors of the press, was just their absolute dedication to word level revision, which, I think in terms of plot, I think in terms of character arcs, I'm thinking, much bigger. And they help me focus on the minutia and help me see how much that can matter. One of the things I'm quite proud of in early feedback from readers of the novel is their comment to me that they couldn't put it down. It was like, okay, one more chapter, one more chapter, one more chapter. That was not a skill I had until I realized that that was at the line level, that was at the word level, that it mattered what that last phrase in a chapter was, that you're like, oh, darn, I got to go to the next chapter. I need to see what happens. And that has been huge for me. And what's changed is now that's a conscious revision process for me. So my next book, Critical State, which will come out in fall of 2026, is a modern day thriller, also set in Boston. The main character is a journalist. I'm very much more conscious now of that style of revision, even as I'm doing a first draft. So I've introduced a new character, so there's a few new scenes in the book that I'm writing right now to try and wrap it up. I'm conscious of how, this character's voice is different from other characters, and it's all down at the word level. It's all down at her vocabulary, her sentence, her sentence structure as she speaks, the kind of voice she has. And that's a level of control I did not have 5 years ago. And I really owe my editors a lot for that, because they helped me see that, trimming hard, getting rid of extra words, being careful about, the diction a character has, and making conscious decisions about, this is, for example, Mev Hayes is a 20 and then 21-year-old woman in Raven. Like, what would her diction be like? What language would she use? As opposed to her professor, as opposed to her friend who's an English major at Harvard, an English PhD student. So that was a big change, and it's fundamentally changed the way I write now. I'm doing that work now consciously in even the first draft rather than something I come to later.
So now, is Boston important? Is it like a setting? Does it turn into a character?
Yeah, it's very important for me. In fact, one of my early Amazon reviews, says this is a love sonnet to Boston, and it absolutely is. One of the really fun things that I was able to do is, there's a lot of institutions in any city that, remember, in Boston, you remember the Worst House, which is a German sort of brew pub that was in Harvard Square, now gone. That's a character. That's in the novel. The Tasty, which was a burger joint that everybody went to in Harvard Square. That's in the novel. The building from World War II that was replaced by the Frank Gehry Status Center on the MIT campus. It was called Building 20. That's in the novel. And for people who knew Boston, and in fact, a reader said to me, the book literally begins with somebody stepping off the number 66 bus in the Allston neighborhood of Boston. He's like, I used to take the number 66. He was incredibly excited about it. This is very much meant to appeal to readers who know the city. If you don't, it teaches you something about it, and especially in that moment. But if you do, then there's a lot of Easter eggs for folks who know Boston really well.
So what do you hope the reader takes away from this book?
I hope it's fun. I mean, I am a consummate reader of thrillers. I read them obviously for craft ideas and for understanding what people do well. But I enjoy the heck out of them. I hope they have a fun read. I hope that it's compelling. Maybe they learn something. There is a lot of tech in here, and I worked really hard to make sure that it was accessible. It is a very particular moment politically. Although this is not a political novel, my next one, Critical State, is. That's set between Boston and Washington, D.C. But it is a very particular moment in history, and I'm hoping that they learn something about that as well.
Did you put a subtext in it, or is it purely entertainment?
That's an interesting question. I was just at a conference. There's a New England crime novel conference called Crime Bake that's held in Boston every year, and it was just 2 weeks ago. And one of the speakers had a session on theme. And so there's kind of a question of, do you start with theme, or does theme evolve or emerge? And the contention was, if you start with theme, then, you're writing a manifesto. And people, as a rule, don't really like reading manifestos. If theme emerges from the story, from the journey of the characters, from the events of the plot, then it becomes a an extra layer of enjoyment for the reader. I didn't necessarily start with a theme, but they definitely emerged. There is absolutely a theme about power and the misuse of power in this book. The main character's journey, puts her in conflict with, someone who is spying against the United States. It puts her in conflict with the Department of Justice. It puts her in conflict with the Irish mob. What justice means is not always completely clear. And so she needs to find a way through this that, we as a reader feel is just, but she is not the one in power for the vast majority of the book. So that definitely emerged as a major. Turns out, I guess that's just something I tend to write about. That's definitely an emergent theme in Critical State, my next novel as well. Is just, the folks who find themselves in a situation where they do not have all of the tools or do not have the position to be able to extricate themselves from danger, and then their path of discovery to those tools, to that way out.
Fantastic. Now, so the book is out. Let's talk about where people find you. Do you have like a website? Do you have what social media do you like readers to follow you on? Do you hang out in a bar? Like where do people find Robert?
There are various bars you can find me in, but online, you can find me on my website at roberttkelley, KELLEY.com. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Blue Sky. I'm on Facebook. And the book itself is available in all of the usual outlets: Amazon, Bookshop, Barnes & Noble. It is available now as a paperback and an ebook, and it's going to be available within days as an audiobook. I'm waiting for final approval from Amazon to release that. So, wherever you find books, you should be able to find it.
Fantastic. Now we'll have everything up on our website so people can find you easily. And what can I say? It's been a pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you both. This has been great. And, thank you to your listeners for their interest in great books.
Of course. Now, we've been talking about Raven. It's a novel, and the guest is the author of that book, Robert T. Kelley. Thanks again.
This has been a production of the House of Mystery Radio Show. To find out more about our show, guests, or hosts, go to our website at houseofmysteryradio.com.